Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to get started in just 2 minutes and allow everyone a chance to log in. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started, and I'll hand it over to our Executive Director, Laurent Hubert.
Thank you, Nichelle. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and welcome to this webinar for the public health community on tobacco industry interference in policymaking, and also the latest release of the Tobacco Industry Interference Index, which is the de facto global monitoring on tobacco industry interference around the globe and in the United States. And ASHA has been involved in tobacco control for over 50 years. And the last 20 years, we've worked a lot in global tobacco control. And one of the things we've done is we've engaged in the development of the Tobacco Treaty, the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And we attend its negotiations, which take place every 2 years. And what's really saddening to hear is that country after country, when they do their first presentation in what's basically this Global Tobacco Control Parliament that takes place every 2 years, country after country state that the biggest obstacle to implementing sound tobacco control policies at country level is the tobacco industry. So basically, in this case, the tobacco industry is the major obstacle to the work they do to protect the right to health of their citizens. So this is something that unfortunately is happening all over the world and also in the United States. And we're not protected from this in the US. So today you will hear from 3 great speakers who have been involved in collecting the US data on tobacco industry interference for the global report, as well as the US report that was released just this week. And they will also share examples of industry interference at the local level. Quick housekeeping before I introduce the speakers. There will be time for questions and answers. Please, you can already type them in the Q&A box. And you can see that Q&A box for me, it's at the bottom of the screen on the Zoom platform. And feel free to direct them to a specific speaker. So I will welcome now the first two speakers who will co-present. Doug Matheny, who's Programs and Initiative Manager for State and Policy, TSET Health Promotion Researcher Center. And Nichelle Gray, who's the Program Coordinator at Action on Smoking and Health, and they will present the US Tobacco Industry Interference Index report. Matt and Nichelle, go ahead.
Thank you, Laurent, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So we're very excited to announce the release of our report this week. But I think it's important for me to start by emphasizing and re-emphasizing that the primary goals of tobacco control are in direct opposition to the goals of the tobacco industry. So tobacco still remains the leading cause of disease and early death here in the US. And it's been proven that effective public health policy can reduce tobacco use. So while we are working to prevent tobacco-related disease and death through effective tobacco control measures, the tobacco industry is working to undermine those measures. And even though the industry sometimes makes statements claiming to be working towards the same goal as the tobacco control community, it's clear that their objective is to maximize tobacco use so that they can ensure that tobacco users remain addicted and continue to buy their products. Their first priority is to maximize their profits. So there's a large body of evidence, not only in our report, but in others, showing that tobacco companies use many tactics to interfere with tobacco control, including financing research, lobbying, campaign contributions, PR campaigns, and a lot more. And the tobacco industry simply should not be considered a stakeholder when it comes to public health policy. So I want to touch on the WHO FCTC, which Laurent mentioned in his opening, because it contains several articles that address effective tobacco control policy measures. And it's really the basis for our US report. Article 5.3 of the WHO FCTC, which talks about the protection of international tobacco control from tobacco industry interference, states that in setting and implementing their public health policies with respect to tobacco control, parties shall act to protect these policies from commercial and other vested interests of the tobacco industry. The preamble of 5.3 also recognizes the need to be alert to any efforts by the tobacco industry to undermine or subvert tobacco control efforts, and the need to be informed of activities of the tobacco industry that have a negative impact on tobacco control efforts. So there are also lesser known articles that also stress the importance of public education and awareness about tobacco industry activities. And as I'll discuss later in my presentation, the indicators of tobacco industry interference used in our report were developed to account for how governments comply with Article 5.3 guidelines. So the purpose of the US Tobacco Industry Interference Index and its parent report, the Global Index, is to define the measures and the elements that contribute to the ability of the tobacco industry to interfere with public health policy making. And the assessments in this report can provide an indication of the US capacity to resist tobacco industry interference. So this report can and should be used as a tool to monitor US progress as we strive toward complying with Article 5.3 guidelines. However, it's important to recognize the limitations that are specific to the US. So for one thing, the US has not ratified the FCTC. And it's simply because it's very hard to do with any treaty in the US. Not only does the president need the consent of 2/3 of the Senate, but more importantly, treaties have the force of national law here. This means that activists can take the US government to court on the basis of treaty commitments. And it also means that judges can instruct the federal government to take steps to meet treaty commitments as well. Second is the scope of the US domestic policy making. In most countries, this happens at the national level and points of entry are limited. However, in the US, there are multiple entry points at the national, state, and local levels. So really, it's important to look at this report more as a summary of what's going on here in the US rather than like a full comprehensive data analysis, because it's simply impossible for us to undertake every jurisdiction's experience. And then finally, third, many of the prohibited activities outlined in the FCTC are actually legal and constitutionally protected in this country. But regardless of these limitations, there's still much that can and should be done to not only expose, but to neutralize tobacco industry interference. So this slide shows the US score this year, which is 66 out of 100. And on the next few slides, we'll dive more into the actual indicators that comprise this score. So again, as Laurent mentioned, the higher the score, the more tobacco industry interference. The US score has improved slightly over last year's score, which was 72 out of 100. But it's also important to remember that last year's report covered 2 years of data. So it covered occurrences of 2017 and 2018. And our 2020 report just covers occurrences in 2019. So regardless of the lower score, it still demonstrates that there's quite a high level of tobacco industry interference. By contrast, you'll see on the slide, there are countries that scored the top 3 countries, which were Brunei, France, and Uganda, which scored 14, 27, and 31 respectively. And then you'll also see on the other end of that spectrum, the bottom 3 countries, which scored 78, which is not far off from where the US was last year, 82 and 88. But even the countries within our own geographic backyard, like Canada and Mexico, have scored better than the US. They both had a score of 47 this year. So where do we derive the US score and what do we mean by indicators? So what we're talking about are the specific entry points for the tobacco industry to influence policy and regulatory mechanisms. Again, these indicators are drawn directly from Article 5.3 guidelines, which have been tailored to focus on situations that are most common and likely to participating countries. So scoring for each indicator depends on the number of incidents and the severity and the frequency of those incidents. So it's on a scale of 0 to 5, and the base score for any incident of interference was 3. And that number is adjusted based on, again, the severity. It's also adjusted based on any mitigating or aggravating measures or counteractions and circumstances. So the main categories for the indicators include levels of participation in policy development, industry-related CSR, corporate social responsibility activities, benefits to the tobacco industry, forms of unnecessary interaction, transparency, conflicts of interest, and preventative measures. So the first category we'll talk about are the levels of participation in policy development. And here what we're talking about are the government accepting the support or collaboration with the industry when it comes to implementing public health policy for tobacco control. We're also talking about government accepting policies drafted by the industry. And we're talking about the industry as a stakeholder, meaning that they sit in on advisory groups or committees for public health policy development. So an example of this, simple example would be the FDA's Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee. They report on recommendations and on safety and health issues around tobacco products. And they have 12 members, 3 of which are non-voting, but also represent tobacco industry and industry interest. So it's important to remember in this section, or to note in this section, indicator number 4, which represents one of the limitations of our report, which I mentioned earlier. Again, the US has not ratified the WHO FCTC, so it doesn't have a formal delegation to send to negotiations. And the Article 5.3 has recommendations for participation in policy development. So this includes that there should be no government partnerships with the tobacco industry or any entity working in their interest. There should be no tobacco industry help with legislative development. The tobacco industry shouldn't be allowed to be a member of any tobacco control public health policy development. And then, of course, this doesn't apply to the US, but if it ever did, no industry involvement in delegations that are sent to the negotiations. So these next two indicator categories cover CSR and benefits to the tobacco industry. And here we're talking about any government participation or endorsement of CSR activities. We're talking about the government receiving CSR contributions from the tobacco industry. And we're also talking about accepting tobacco industry requests for postponement of tobacco control laws. So a simple example for this would be if the industry offered to help the US government distributing the new COVID-19 vaccine, or they help with the distribution of supplies after natural disasters. And the recommendations here are very simple and clear. There should be no government participation or co-sponsorship with the tobacco industry and any CSR activities or events. The government shouldn't accept political or social or financial or educational or community contributions from the industry. But there is one exception if the compensation is due to legal settlements or mandated by law. And then obviously no granting incentives to the industry or their entities, and no preferential tax exemption to the tobacco industry. So the next area that we'll talk about are forms of unnecessary interaction. This would include government officials that have relationships or attend social events sponsored by the industry. This also includes government accepting assistance with the enforcement of policies. And this also includes entering into agreements or partnerships with the tobacco industry. So within these categories, an example would be inaugural events that have been hosted by the tobacco industry for politicians. And again, the recommendations here are clear. No interaction with the tobacco industry except when necessary to regulate the industry and its products. So I'll move on to the next few. We have transparency and conflicts of interest. Here we're talking about non-disclosure of meetings or interactions with the tobacco industry. We're also talking about government requirements for disclosures or registrations of groups that are acting in the tobacco industry's interests, so lobbying groups. We're talking about lack of government prohibition of contributions from the tobacco industry. And this also covers ex and current government officials or their family members that work for the tobacco industry. So here, the 5.3 recommendations state that, if it's necessary to deal with the tobacco industry, then it needs to be as transparent as possible. So meetings should be conducted in public. There should be a public notice of any interactions with the industry, and there needs to be disclosure of the records from those interactions. The government should not accept tobacco industry political campaign contributions, but if they do, then they should provide full disclosure of those contributions. Government officials should declare any current or previous work that they've done with or for the tobacco industry. They shouldn't allow any person that's employed by the tobacco industry to work for a government body or committee or advisory group, especially if they're working on tobacco control or public health policy. And they shouldn't allow any official or employee of the government to accept gifts or services of monetary or in kind from the tobacco industry. So the final category for our indicators include preventative measures. So this would include a procedure of disclosure when interacting with the tobacco industry. It includes an official code of conduct for public officials when they're dealing with the tobacco industry. The government requiring the tobacco industry to submit lobbying or political contributions and marketing disclosures. It also includes the government providing a program of awareness for Article 5.3 and an official government policy to disallow contributions and gifts and policy drafts by the tobacco industry. So again, the recommendations here from 5.3 are very clear. The tobacco industry should periodically submit information on tobacco production, manufacture, marketing expenditures, lobbying, political campaign contributions. And there are departments within the government that do collect that information regularly. And then finally, the government should not accept, support, or endorse any offer of assistance or proposed tobacco control legislation or policy drafted by or with the tobacco industry. So I hope that this was at least a little bit useful for you, and that you actually read the report to learn more about the 2020 indicators and the scores. And then with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Doug Matheny, to talk more about industry activities and the key recommendations from our report for advocates and legislators.
Hi, thanks, Nichelle, and great job going through all of those. I'm going to start with a little background specific to the United States, and that is that the major tobacco companies in the US have actually been adjudicated as racketeers in federal court. The case actually started in 1999, took 7 years to bring it to trial. And in 2006, they did rule, the judge ruled that the companies were guilty of at least 145 violations of the RICO Act. Very important point that the tobacco industry not only lied to the public, but also to lawmakers. So they've misinformed our lawmakers, and by extension, they've misinformed our public policies. Also very important to the RICO law in the US, the court had to find that these companies would likely continue to commit fraud. They had to show that it was an ongoing behavior, and the court indeed did find that in this case. So in 2017, the companies had to begin publishing what's called corrective statements ordered by the court. And so those are still being published. They'll be on the company's websites essentially forever. And the case is actually still active now, a 21-year-old case, with companies, with the tobacco companies fighting the placement of these corrective statements at retail point of sale. So the corrective statements, of course, will do little good without corrective action. And that's really the point of this report. It's important for public health leaders and state and local coalitions to educate the public and lawmakers about how and why the tobacco industry lies have indeed misinformed public policy for decades. So, Nichelle, if you could move to the next slide. So this slide looks at, on the left, a 1989 quote from R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, where it basically lays out their strategy, not unlike the strategies for Philip Morris or for the Tobacco Institute at the time, to defeat or limit all legislative attempts to basically do anything that would reduce tobacco use. On the right, as included in the report, mention of a recent analysis of internal tobacco industry documents that show that indeed, since the 1990s, tobacco companies have led efforts, successful efforts, to defeat in each of the 50 states legislation that was proposed in 5 different areas, basically all major areas of tobacco control law. Next slide, Nichelle. Thanks. So basically, with this infographic, we can see kind of how it works. You start with national, state, and local lawmakers. In many cases, as we know, champions within legislatures and state or local governments as well, and at the national level, have proposed effective bills supported by local and state and national coalitions. Tobacco industry interference has very often managed to either kill, weaken, or delay effective bills. We've all seen this time and time again. Our laws that are in effect now reflect, of course, that interference and those weakened laws when they did pass. So we have these less effective laws in place, which of course leads to preventable illness, death, and economic costs. Where we want to be, of course, is to expose and, as Michelle said, neutralize tobacco industry interference so that we can end up with that, the better laws and a stronger, healthier society. There have been pockets of tremendous progress, but all states' tobacco control laws continue to fall short of best practices in one or more areas of law. Next slide, please. Thanks. So we'll never know how many lives could have been saved if not for these decades of tobacco industry interference. But what we can do at this point is to make sure that we regularly monitor and report interference as a moral imperative. In this year's report, ASH has featured 9 recent examples of tobacco industry interference at the state level. And ASH is encouraging, I understand, states and communities to begin sending in examples of tobacco industry interference as they occur, so that these can be included in next year's report. Next slide. So this report offers 8 recommendations for counteracting past and present tobacco industry interference. As always in tobacco control, action at the state and local level is especially important. ASH is putting together a series of webinars, in fact, over the next few months to bring in guest speakers for each of these 8 topics. So I'll go through them very briefly today. Each of these 8 recommendations are designed to be specific to the US and to be scalable and adaptable for use in any given state or community. You'll recognize many of them from the 5.3 recommendations, but again, these are all very workable and realistic and achievable in the United States. So the first one is raise awareness. So recognizing the problem is the first step. Raising awareness of tobacco industry interference could indeed be considered a key component of the tobacco control vaccine, that basically we're exposing our opposition. Press events, op-eds, letters to the editor, all of the standard earned media strategies could be used to highlight the impact of past and present interference and the need for corrective action. The second one is employing available resources, using existing fact sheets or resolutions, infographics, social media resources, templates that have been developed to feature key findings, for instance, from the ongoing federal racketeering case. Recent polling has shown that the public is not aware of a lot of the information. Even though the corrective statements were published, they did not get high visibility, and further, even less known is why the corrective statements were actually required to be run. That is the racketeering verdict itself. Also, quotes from internal documents as featured in this report, and as Michelle's been featuring, quotes from internal tobacco industry documents are very useful for showing how and why the industry does what they do. So the last page of the report actually has a great listing of resources available online that can be translated for use in any given community or state. Third one is leveraging public support. So polling does show strong public support against tobacco industry interference in lawmaking and for effective tobacco control laws. This strong public support can be demonstrated and leveraged using organizational resolutions or legislative resolutions, constituent petitions, letter writing campaigns, and other forms of grassroots mobilization. The fourth one is track lobbying activities. So all states require lobbying registration and reports. Some states require reporting of all expenditures for or against specific legislation and/or what proportion of lobbyist services or campaign contributions, meals, or gifts are financed by each of their respective clients. As you know, many lobbyists represent different clients. In our state, we don't have the benefit of knowing when they take a lawmaker to dinner, for instance, which of their clients paid for that dinner. Other states do have that advantage, and that could be useful. So all of that kind of information can be helpful to advocates in again, kind of exposing exactly what's going on in their state at any given time or any given year. So the next slide goes to the last 5 of the recommendations. That number 5 is increased transparency. Government officials could also be reasonably required to report interactions with any corporate entity that has an adjudicated record of federal racketeering. So this might be an example where the tobacco industry could be singled out. I don't think any state has tried that yet, but again, it could be reasonably suggested at least. Since the tobacco industry likes to work behind the scenes, disclosures of interactions with lawmakers, as discussed in the previous recommendation, of all interactions with all industries, including transcripts of meetings, would help to deter interference. The 6th one is adopting official codes of conduct. So the principal objective of each public official is the welfare of the people. So official codes of conduct, including strict rules against conflicts of interest, can and should be adopted to reduce interference. This is especially warranted for, again, the tobacco industry. The number 7 is reject tobacco industry gifts. Lawmakers should be encouraged and recognized for voluntarily rejecting campaign contributions and gifts from tobacco companies or tobacco company lobbyists. Likewise, in the public sector, or private sector rather, organizational policies can reject any so-called corporate social responsibility, as Michelle was talking about, or CSR for short, activities, and other kinds of proposed partnerships. These partnerships can be used by the tobacco industry to provide political cover that might help defeat, weaken, or delay essential public policies. So when organizations come to understand how they are used basically by the industry through these CSR donations, they may choose to reject those opportunities. And finally, number 8, divesting from tobacco. Several states and localities have already voluntarily divested all public funds, including all government pension funds. Other states should consider following those states' examples. So I'll hand it back to Laurent, I guess.
Thank you very much, Doug and Michelle, for this very comprehensive presentation, which covered from the FCTC to the Tobacco Industry Interference Index, its data, as well as recommendations for public health community to move these things forward. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Just before, quickly, I just want to make a very statement on the FCTC. Michelle rightly pointed out that the US has not ratified the FCTC, but the US has, however, negotiated all of the sessions of the FCTC. The US was among the 190 countries that adopted the FCTC in 2003, and the US did sign onto the FCTC, so basically kind of a soft commitment to the FCTC. So while it's not legally bound to it because it's not ratified it, it's committed in that way. And also it's worth pointing out that the United States has adopted the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which call for an accelerated implementation of the FCTC and collect data, call on countries to collect data, and call on countries to reduce smoking. So the US has a lot of soft obligations to the FCTC, so to speak, and it has the obligation to protect its citizens and the health of its citizens against the tobacco industry. So our next speaker will actually give us examples of tobacco industry interference at the very local level, again, and how the industry really does everything it can to protect its interests against the interests of public health. Kathleen, please go ahead.
Thank you, Laurent. I think it's so very American of us to love the agreement and have everyone else have to abide by it, but refuse to do so ourselves. So let's choose to be better in 2021 America. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in the webinar here. I really enjoyed listening to both Nichelle and Doug talking about the report, which I know a lot of us at the state and local level will make good use of, going forward. I was asked to come talk to you about my experience really working at the state and local level here in Maryland, where I've done tobacco control and prevention work for over 20 years. So that's the focus of my talk. I was struck by Nichelle talking about the legislative and just the different ways that there can be industry interference. And my talk actually covers all of them at the administrative level, so with regulations, at the legislative level, so with the legislature, and in court. And so we're covering all of our bases in that regard. So first is the substance of where the interference occurred here for my talk. Both Prince George's County, Maryland, which is a DC suburb, as well as Baltimore City, this was back in 2008 and 2009, we're dealing with a massive uptick in the use of small cigars or cigarillos, Black and Mild, Swisher Sweet, and the like, by young people, particularly purchasing the product in singles. So they could purchase one for 75 cents at the store, not having to purchase a whole pack. So they could easily scrape together the money to purchase one. I will say there was an impression that that young people were using these to what they call freak a blunt, or use the casing of the small cigar to smoke marijuana. And of course that was true, but there were also many young people, particularly our youngers, our 12s to 14s and 14s to 16s, who were actually first experimenting with tobacco using these products. So they were particularly concerning for us from a long-term tobacco use perspective. Baltimore City and Prince George's County decided to take action on kind of a very small level to say there would have to be minimum pack sizes of 5 so that you couldn't sell the singles for 75 cents, thus raising the price of access just enough to hopefully put it out of reach, particularly to our very price conscious 12 to 14 and 14 to 16-year-olds. So Baltimore City did it by regulation. The health commissioner has broad public health power in Baltimore City, and so went through a regulatory process, sought feedback from the public as is a required component of the process, and there were innumerable comments submitted by the industry suggesting, such a minor provision as cigar packaging was overreach and would hurt the economy and hurt small businesses throughout the city. And then in Prince George's County, they took it up as a legislative matter. So Prince George's County Council heard a couple of bills, but the underlying theme being minimum pack size also being set at 5. And at these public hearings, I was speaking about this recently. I go to a lot of local council hearings throughout the state of Maryland on public health issues. And, we're pretty excited when we see, 10 people maybe there on our topic. That means there are 10 people interested enough to come and talk to their local council members. But anytime we're there on an issue related to the tobacco industry that regulates tobacco, there's no shortage of people there to testify and even to attend, because the industry comes out in force. And so I remember these hearings being quite packed and actually even waiting out in the hallway and talking to some of the lobbyists from the tobacco industry as we waited for our bill to get called. So both of these provisions did pass. So the health commissioner for Baltimore City, Dr. Josh Sharfstein, imposed or promulgated his regulation in final form, and the council did pass the bill imposing the packaging standard, and both were promptly sued by industry. And so the case name that I'll talk about is Altatus. That's a cigar manufacturing company, but there were other members of the tobacco industry that were part of the plaintiff crew there. They also, as they commonly do, have some retail establishments that they bring in as well as plaintiffs in the case. As a side note, I believe they filed that litigation on the precipice of the winter holidays, the Christmas season, and it was, frustrating to get that litigation filed and on an emergency basis, saying they needed a restraining order so that the bill would not go into effect over the holidays. That's just a classic tactic of the industry to make it difficult even for the lawyers who are litigating the cases. So ultimately, the case was filed, and it took 3 years, actually like 3.5 years, for the Maryland Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in Maryland, to rule in the case. I will situate yourself first to say, in Prince George's County, the court found that the ordinance was constitutional, that the county had the authority and was not preempted from imposing. So it did uphold the regulation. However, at industry request, the court did stay the enforcement of the ordinance while the case was on appeal. So the ordinance never actually went into effect in Prince George's County. The Maryland Court of Appeals doesn't take every appeal. There's an intermediate appellate court called the Court of Special Appeals. But this case was so attractive to the Maryland Court of Appeals that they reached down and took it from the intermediate appellate court. And in fact, at the request of industry, they did so. And so again, here we are facing, having won in the circuit court, but facing a case in the Maryland Court of Appeals. And again, after that 3.5 years of waiting for the decision, which is unusual, the court ruled against Prince George's County, which ultimately impacted Baltimore City as well. Baltimore City had stayed that case pending the outcome of the Prince George's County case. And here the court ruled that the state law preempted. So I don't know how many of you all are lawyers or have heard of this term before, but essentially that the state was regulating so much in the space of tobacco regulation, in who can buy tobacco, where they can buy it, how they can buy it, et cetera, that there was no room left for local jurisdictions to regulate. And so that, while the state never said explicitly that local jurisdictions could not regulate tobacco sales, the court said we're going to imply that from the state having so many laws regulating tobacco products or the sale of tobacco products. We don't have time for me to explain to you why I think that decision is terribly wrong, but I will talk to you about the impact of that. So both Baltimore City and Baltimore City and Prince George's County were prevented from enforcing their cigar packaging provisions, of course, but so much more from a fallout perspective. So from a prospective level, local jurisdictions throughout the state of Maryland, some which have been really innovative and progressive with respect to public health policy and public health policy in the tobacco space, have been prevented from passing new laws related to tobacco sales and distribution. So as of that decision in 2013, there hasn't even been the introduction or consideration of tobacco regulation laws at the local level in Maryland. And also importantly, at that time, there were jurisdictions that had local tobacco laws on their books that had to stop regulating or stop enforcing those bills. Specifically, Baltimore City, for example, had a provision also related to the sale of single cigarettes. And Baltimore City was, through their lawyers, told the health department to stop enforcing that provision because it too was likely subject to preemption, as a result of the case. So once again, we have no ability to pass laws moving forward at the local level and stopping enforcement of local laws related to tobacco, that had already been on the books. I will note this relates to tobacco product sales and not to use of tobacco products, so that local clean indoor air laws that provide smoke-free places throughout the state, we now do have a state law as well, but those remained in effect. This did not impact those. So what are the types of opportunities we know, have been impeded here? Well, first, obviously, the cigar pack size. Cigars, until they took over, cigars for a decade were a serious problem for youth in Maryland, particularly in Baltimore City. They did become the product of choice, and cigarettes were second to cigars. And there was not only the inability to regulate pack size, but jurisdictions couldn't impose, for example, a tobacco 21 standard. We do now have that in the US, both at the federal level and in Maryland at the state level, but we had local jurisdictions that were interested in pursuing tobacco 21 legislation, and they did not go forward with that for fear of preemption. And then probably the biggest one was, and the most frustrated the locals was about not being able to prohibit the sale of flavored tobacco products, which in the US has been a continuous issue, not just associated with vape products, which I know, in many jurisdictions, their flavored restrictions apply just to vape products, but to flavored cigars, flavored smokeless tobacco, as well as flavored vape products, and frankly, flavored hookah. So there were jurisdictions really chomping at the bit in Maryland to be able to do more when it came to local tobacco regulation, but they were prohibited from doing so because the industry used their litigation skills and won that case on preemption. What have we done as a result? This is a difficult situation to be in, and it was a huge victory for the industry because they can much more effectively impact legislation at the state level, where they perhaps have more impact on legislators. There are, state lobbyists who have more impact and influence over statewide legislators. There's more money in those campaigns. There's, far more lobbyist kind of capture and industry capture at the state level. At the local level, that's not the case. And so it was a huge victory for the industry to get this provision, to get the court to decide that there was preemption. We have tried to get it reversed. You can see here in 2016, we had a bill in that was specifically to reverse the decision so that the Maryland legislature would say, nope, didn't matter if the court got it right or wrong, but we don't intend to preempt local jurisdictions from acting in the tobacco regulatory space. That failed in committee, really didn't have legs at all. Not many people were interested in it. And of course, industry came out in opposition to it, suggesting they couldn't possibly abide by different rules in the 24 local jurisdictions in Maryland, even though they had been prior to the 2013 case. There was a similar bill in 2019 that didn't really apply just to tobacco, but wouldn't have allowed courts to find implied preemption, that the legislature either has to say there's preemption or not. And then moving forward this year, one of the leading issues that the tobacco control advocates and public health folks in Maryland are going to be working on is an explicit non-preemption provision. So reversing the impact of that Altatus decision and returning to the locals where it should be the power to regulate their communities with respect to access to and distribution of tobacco products, the who, what, where, why, whens, and hows of access to tobacco being returned to the local jurisdictions. What are our chances of success? I can't possibly guess on that. It's such a weird session because there won't be any in-person hearings, and there's extremely limited in-person meetings with legislators. And perhaps that would inure to the benefit of public health folks. So we don't have the kind of powerful, we have great lobbyists, but we don't have the same numbers or the same folks, with a lot more persuasion and power down there. And so it's entirely possible. It's also possible it's more difficult for us to get our voice heard because we're not able to meet with members individually and explain to them the importance of the bill. And so we'll see what the impact of COVID is on us moving things forward. Just want to take 2 minutes because I'd really rather use the rest of the time for Q&A. But just some other thoughts. I've been working for more than 20 years at the state and local level in Maryland and now nationally on tobacco control and prevention, what it looks like to have the industry on the other side, particularly in the policy realm. And I can tell you that working with some local jurisdictions in the Northeast years ago when they wanted to prohibit what we call power walls, where, if you walk into a convenience store or other tobacco seller and you see the whole wall of all of the cigarette cartons, and it's just free advertising for them. It's right there on every sale. Every person is seeing it. And jurisdictions wanted to, put them behind a curtain or a white wall. And one local jurisdiction, did impose such an ordinance and immediately got sued. And despite the offer of support from many in the public health community, they ultimately withdrew the ordinance, and all of the other jurisdictions that were working on similar ordinances were deterred from doing so. Local jurisdictions just don't have the manpower, they don't have the legal resource or the money, and sometimes just the staying power to be able to fight the litigation that comes from the tobacco industry. And then one here in Maryland that happened most recently for us is when we imposed a tobacco licensing standard for vape sellers. So prior to a couple of years ago, vape sellers weren't licensed in Maryland, whereas all other tobacco sellers were. We successfully got a licensing provision passed, and it prohibited the direct sale. We don't allow the direct sale of cigarettes or other tobacco products to consumers in Maryland. You have to go through the wholesaler and then the retailer, who are in the licensing scheme and subject to regulation by our comptroller. And in our licensing bill, the same restriction applied to the sale of vape products, even though R.J. Reynolds at the time was hotly against that, fought really hard to get that provision not in the bill that passed. And public health considered it a great success that we got it in there. So there could not be the direct sale of these products. Immediately for the next session, it opened with an emergency bill getting passed to take away that prohibition and to allow the sale, the direct sale from manufacturer to consumer of vape products. And it took us all by surprise. We knew nothing of it. It was a victory we had celebrated, and boom, I know it was tobacco industry influence that took away that success pretty rapidly as soon as we hit the next session. So this is what it looks like when you're at the state and local level and trying to regulate for the benefit of the public health, for particularly for youth, and the other side has a lot more resource and a lot more influence than you do. And there you go.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for those very, very concrete examples of interference at the local level. And I omitted to introduce you in between the speakers and computers.
Seriously, don't worry about that. I'd rather spend the time talking to the folks, answering their questions.
Just very quickly, Kathleen Helps-System is just director of the Legal Resource Center for Public Health Policy and director of the new Network for Public Health Law Eastern Region at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. So again, thank you so much. We will move on then now to the Q&A section. Again, you can direct them to a specific speaker and use the Q&A box. And we have already a number of questions that are open. And the first one, it's on the definition of tobacco industry, as we were looking into the industry interference. Who's included in that definition, or hookah, sellers, vaping, or who was included in that definition as you're collecting the data?
Yes, actually, I saw that question, and that would include hookah manufacturers as well as combustible tobacco products, e-cigarettes, and all of those forms of tobacco products as well. Because they do represent harm to public health. So they are outlined in FCTC articles and guidelines.
Thank you. The next question is on, and we touched on that a little bit, the fact that the FCTC has not ratified the FCTC, so it's gone almost all the way through it. It's like kind of like, it's like dating but not yet married with the FCTC. So given that it's not ratified it, with Article 5.3, which is the one then that prohibits tobacco industry interference in policymaking, how can those limits how can we use the guidelines to motivate better behaviors from the industry in the United States? And maybe Kathleen, Michelle, Doug, do you want to go first, Kathleen?
Wow. I don't know. Maybe Doug, I don't know. Nothing came to mind.
Well, the recommendations in the report are largely translated from the Article 5.3, kind of for use in the U.S. So looking through those 8 recommendations, I would think that you can come close to at least the spirit, and in many cases really make some tremendous progress. Again, we've got public opinion on our side. We've got so much good information on our side that if we share that information using the skills that have been used in the tobacco control community for so many years now through earned media and through use of resolutions and petitions and grassroots mobilization and so forth, all of those things basically to make tobacco industry interference have a much higher profile can really serve to, I think, help invigorate tobacco control initiatives and accelerate the adoption of effective policies.
Yeah, and I would just add to Doug that ASH in a lot of our publications, we state that regardless of whether the US ratifies the FCTC, it's still a very useful tool. Its guidelines really are best practice in terms of tobacco control measures. So we can still try to adhere to those as much as possible. And it's not just with industry interference. There are other guidelines that are useful that we can employ in this country around smoke-free air and end game policies and different things like that. So it really is a collection of the best practices available and at our disposal, and it's really on advocates to push for these stronger policies.
Indeed, I would fully endorse that statement. The FCTC enshrines the minimum standards that the country should implement to protect their citizens. And why should the US not be protected in the same ways as other nations? Imagine in context of COVID, this would be the equivalent of saying, because we could say the FCTC's and tobacco control policies are a form of vaccine. COVID-19, and we will have vaccine. Imagine if the US government said, oh no, we're not going to implement it in this country. And then you had like the pro-COVID supporters saying, doing everything to, once the US would try to implement, make access to COVID, saying, oh no, we don't want to have any, we don't want to provide access to vaccines to the US population. And that's what the industry does when it blocks tobacco control policy at country level. There's some questions in the context of the pandemic and with COVID-19. Have there been any particular cases of tobacco industry interference that you've noted that have been specific during the pandemic?
I can speak to this, and I think we have some people on the call who are actually in South Africa that could probably even speak to it even more. But there definitely the industry has been involved in trying to oppose the bans in South Africa. BAT, the Fair Trade Independent Tobacco Association as well, have been fought against the bans when they were implemented. And I think Peter is on the call. I don't know if he wanted to speak a little bit more to that. I could unmute you.
I don't think we will have the time for this because we only have like 4 minutes left. So I may maybe keep it to, but it seems like there's been indeed some, and I know in other jurisdictions, there's been some level of industry interference. There was a question on the, Kathleen, you in your presentation, you made a very specific statement around the implied preemption ruling being erroneous, and something that seems to come up a fair amount in tobacco control. And if you could maybe expand on that.
Sure. And I see that question comes from Thomas. Thomas, feel free to reach out to me for more if you have 3 days. No, I mean 3 hours. That's all I'll take. But the bottom line is two things. One is, as I indicated, these bills passed and the regulation was imposed in 2008 and 2009. the court's decision hinges pretty significantly on a bill that was passed by the state legislature in 2011. So after the case was even argued before the court. And that bill was a bill that was brought forth by public health folks to license what we call OTP sellers, other tobacco product sellers, not vapes, but smokeless and cigars, et cetera. We had only had cigarette licensing. And so this licensed OTP sellers. And so they used a statute that was passed well after the fact that was just about licensing the sale of OTP, contains no substantive restrictions on, pack size or anything like that, to say the 2008 and 2009 bills were preempted. So that's part of it. And the second is, the court talks about the kind of vast array of regulations that the state has in tobacco regulation, and that really is not true from a substantive perspective. There are these licensing provisions and all the rules about who has to report to who, as well as the rule against sales to minors. But otherwise, there is very little at the state level with respect to regulating the sale and distribution of tobacco products. And so for both of those reasons, I found the court's reasoning to be wrong, erroneous, as you say. But again, happy to talk with you more about it.
Thanks. Well, we're about to run out of time, so I'm not going to be asking any questions, but I would like to give the opportunity to the three panelists to maybe give like 30 seconds max concluding remarks, and also where can people find the report, because there's some questions where some people are not exactly sure where to find it. So if I give you each 30 seconds before I close. Doug, why don't you start, since I have you on my, let's start with you, Doug, Nichelle, and Kathleen.
Okay, thanks, Laurent. So this report is the second time that the U.S. has put together something like this, and hopefully it will continue. I think it will help sort of institutionalize the importance of exposing tobacco industry interference in lawmaking. As Nichelle said, those points that basically with tobacco use being the leading preventable cause of death, we know that in tobacco control that policy is our best tool against the problem, and then beyond that we know the tobacco industry is our primary obstacle to accomplishing effective tobacco control policy. So as we make it more and more the norm, this is nothing new. Many advocates have done this for many, many years and decades in many states and across the country, but it becomes even more maybe useful as it just becomes a standard part of any tobacco control campaign.
Thank you. Nichelle, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that there are many opportunities for us to raise awareness, and that starts with, actually tracking this information and sharing it as much as possible. So this is an annual report of ours, and every year, the last 2 years that we've collected the data for this report, we have gotten an increase of information from state and local advocates. So I encourage everyone to send their information to me. My contact details will be in the follow-up email to this webinar. And let's just keep tracking these instances so we can really highlight them and really use them for effective change in tobacco policy.
Well, thank you again for inviting me to talk. I'm going to say, Phil, why don't you reach out to me separately if you want to talk about what I think might happen at the federal level. But I want to close with reminding you that public health has always been at its best when it is local. Communities know what they need, know what their problems are, and can be best at problem solving. And so, and that is also where the tobacco industry has the least influence. So for those of you working at the international level, at the federal level here in the US, or at the state level, don't forget about looking at encouraging and supporting your local governments in engaging in innovative tobacco control policy, and always be on the lookout for preemption, because it does stunt the growth of those local efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. And for those of you interested in more, to want to hear more about the report, you can find it on our website, ash.org, 2020 index. You can see it on the screen. And then there's also the STOP partnership, Stopping Tobacco Organizations and Products Global Tobacco Industry Interference Index. And the link is on our site. There will also be a blog for the British Medical Journal on this topic that we hope will be published soon. So follow us to hear more updates about this. So again, thank you to all of you for joining us today. I want a big thanks to the panelists and to all of you who joined us from the US and around the world. And we wish you happy holidays and a happy holiday season. And please stay tuned in for the 2021 webinars, as there will be a lot happening next year. Thank you very much and stay safe.